The word untamable hung in the air like a blade poised to fall, and Seraphina felt every pair of eyes in the great hall burning into her skin as she stood before the Council of Immortals, her hands trembling despite her efforts to appear composed. The ancient stone walls seemed to lean inward, pressing the weight of centuries of tradition onto her shoulders as torchlight flickered across the assembled faces, some curious, others disapproving, all waiting to witness what they believed would be her inevitable surrender. She had never wanted this moment to come. For months, whispers had followed her through the narrow cobblestone streets of Umbraloon, the village nestled between towering pines where mortals and immortals coexisted under rules older than memory itself. The whispers spoke of her defiance, her refusal to bow to conventions that had bound women for generations, her stubborn insistence that she would choose her own path even if it meant walking it alone. But now, standing in the ceremonial chamber with its vaulted ceiling disappearing into shadows, she realized that choice might have been an illusion all along. Darius stepped forward, his presence commanding the attention of everyone in the room without effort. As the leader of the Immortals, he carried himself with the quiet authority of someone who had never needed to raise his voice to be heard, never needed to threaten to be feared. His dark hair was pulled back severely, revealing the sharp angles of a face that could have been carved from the same stone as the ancient statues that lined the hall's perimeter. But it was his eyes that made Seraphina's breath catch in her throat. Pale silver that seemed to see straight through her carefully constructed defenses, past her anger and fear to something deeper she wasn't ready to acknowledge. "The ritual has been called," he said, his voice carrying easily through the vast space despite its measured tone. "The bonds of tradition demand acknowledgement. Step forward, Seraphina of the Western Quarter." Her legs felt like lead as she moved toward him, each step echoing off the stone floor with a finality that made her stomach clench. The ceremonial braziers cast dancing shadows on the walls, and she could smell the mixture of sacred herbs and old smoke that permeated every formal gathering of the council. Behind her, she heard the rustle of fabric as the assembled witnesses leaned forward, eager to see how this would end. "I didn't ask for this," she whispered as she stopped before him, close enough now to see the way the torchlight caught the silver threads embroidered into his formal robes, close enough to feel the coolness that seemed to emanate from his skin like morning mist. "Neither did I," he replied, so quietly that only she could hear. For just a moment, something flickered across his features, uncertainty perhaps or regret, before the mask of authority settled back into place. "But we are bound by laws older than either of us. Give me your hand." Seraphina's fingers moved to the pendant at her throat without conscious thought, a habit she'd developed over the years whenever anxiety threatened to overwhelm her. The ancient metal felt warm against her palm, its surface worn smooth by countless nervous touches. She had inherited it from her grandmother, along with vague stories about their family's history that had never made complete sense. Old tales of nobility and sacrifice, of bloodlines that carried both honor and burden in equal measure. "Your hand," Darius repeated, extending his own toward her. His fingers were long and pale, unmarked by the calluses that decorated her own from years of helping in the village workshops and gardens. When she hesitated, his expression softened almost imperceptibly. "I will not force you, but the ritual must be witnessed. The choice ultimately remains yours." The irony of his words struck her like a physical blow. Choice, as if standing here, surrounded by the most powerful beings in their realm, with centuries of tradition bearing down upon her, constituted any real choice at all. As if the expectations of her community, the weight of her family's mysterious legacy, and the strange pull she felt toward this enigmatic man didn't combine to create a trap as inescapable as any physical cage. She placed her hand in his. The moment their skin touched, the pendant against her chest flared with a subtle warmth that made her gasp. The sensation was like nothing she had ever experienced. Not painful exactly, but so unexpected that it took her breath away. The ancient metal seemed to pulse with its own rhythm, and she could have sworn she heard a low, resonant tone that made the flames of the surrounding torches waver as if touched by an invisible wind. The great hall fell silent. Darius's fingers tightened around hers, not roughly but with a sudden intensity that spoke of surprise rather than control. His silver eyes widened, and she saw her own shock reflected in his gaze as they both realized that something had gone wrong, or perhaps terrifyingly right. The ceremonial binding that should have sealed their connection, that should have marked her acceptance of his claim and her place within the immortal hierarchy, simply failed to manifest. Instead, the air around them seemed to thicken with possibility, with the weight of promises yet unmade and futures still unwritten. A collective shiver ran through the assembled witnesses, as if they could sense that old powers had stirred, that sleeping magics had awakened to possibilities no one had prepared for. Elder Matthias, the council's most senior member, leaned forward in his ornate chair, his ancient eyes narrowing as he studied the scene before him. "Curious," he murmured, his voice carrying the dry rustiness of centuries. "The binding fails, yet the resonance suggests—" He trailed off, shaking his head as if dismissing his own thoughts as impossible. "What does it mean?" Seraphina asked, her voice barely above a whisper. She tried to pull her hand free from Darius's grasp, but he held firm, his attention fixed on the pendant at her throat with an expression she couldn't read. "I'm not certain," he admitted, and the honesty in his voice sent another tremor through the watching crowd. The leader of the Immortals was supposed to have answers, was supposed to understand the ancient ways better than anyone. His uncertainty was perhaps more unsettling than the failed ritual itself. Cordelia, the highest-ranking courtesan among the immortal nobility, rose gracefully from her seat near the front of the assembly. Her golden hair was arranged in an elaborate style that spoke of hours of careful preparation, and her dress of deep blue silk was cut to emphasize both her beauty and her status. She moved with the predatory grace of someone accustomed to getting what she wanted, and the smile that curved her lips was as sharp as polished steel. "Perhaps," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the hall, "this is precisely what it appears to be, a rejection. The girl is as untamable as we suspected, and even the ancient powers recognize that some bonds should not be forced." Seraphina felt heat rise in her cheeks at the dismissive tone, the way Cordelia spoke about her as if she weren't standing right there, as if her presence in this hall was an inconvenience to be quickly resolved. But before she could respond, Marcus, the village's resident scholar and keeper of old texts, cleared his throat pointedly from his position near the back of the hall. "With respect, Lady Cordelia," he said, his voice carrying the careful deference of someone who knew his place, but also knew his worth, "the historical precedents suggest something quite different. When the binding fails but the resonance remains, it typically indicates not rejection but—" He paused, seeming to weigh his words carefully. "But a matter of timing, of readiness, of powers not yet fully awakened." "What powers?" Seraphina demanded, finally managing to pull her hand free from Darius's grip. The pendant at her throat had cooled, but she could still feel its weight against her skin like a brand. "I'm not some mystical being hiding in plain sight. I'm just a girl from the village who wants to choose her own path." "Are you?" Elder Matthias asked, his tone deceptively mild. "Tell me, child, what do you know of your heritage, of the line from which you spring?" The question hit her like cold water, washing away her anger and leaving only confusion in its wake. The truth was, she knew almost nothing. Her grandmother had died when Seraphina was still young, taking most of the family stories with her to the grave. There had been hints, fragments of tales about ancestors who had served the old courts, who had played important roles in the early days of the covenant between mortal and immortal. but nothing concrete. Nothing that would explain why a simple pendant would react to an immortal binding ritual. "I know enough," she said finally, lifting her chin in the gesture of defiance that had earned her the reputation for being difficult. "I know that my choices are my own, regardless of what blood runs in my veins." Darius studied her face with an intensity that made her want to look away, but she forced herself to meet his gaze steadily. After a long moment, he nodded slowly, as if coming to some internal decision. "The ritual will be postponed," he announced, his words sending a wave of murmurs through the assembled crowd, "until the next new moon, when the old laws allow for reconsideration of interrupted ceremonies. In the meantime, Seraphina will remain under the protection of the Council while we investigate what has occurred here tonight." "Protection or imprisonment?" she asked, the words escaping before she could stop them. His smile was barely visible, just a slight curve at the corner of his mouth that somehow made him seem more human and more dangerous at the same time. "That, I suspect, will depend entirely on how cooperative you choose to be." As the formal assembly began to disperse, Seraphina found herself surrounded by a small group of individuals whose interest in her situation was becoming increasingly clear. Elena, the village healer, approached with the same gentle manner that had comforted Seraphina through childhood illnesses and adolescent heartbreaks. Her graying hair was pulled back in a simple bun, and her practical dress bore the stains of her trade, herb residue and healing oils that spoke of a life spent in service to others. "Come, child," Elena said softly, placing a warm hand on Seraphina's arm. "You'll stay with me tonight. There's much we need to discuss, and I suspect you'll have questions that deserve honest answers." Thomas, her childhood friend who now played music in the village tavern, lingered near the hall's exit as the crowd filtered out around him. His dark hair fell across his forehead in waves that he constantly pushed back when he was nervous, and his fingers drummed against his leg in the rhythm of whatever melody was currently stuck in his head. When their eyes met across the emptying space, she saw worry there, and something deeper that made her chest tight with emotions she wasn't ready to examine. "Sarah," he called softly, using the nickname only he was allowed to speak. "Remember what we talked about. If things get too complicated, if the pressure becomes too much." He didn't finish the sentence, but she understood. He was offering her an escape route, a way to disappear into the wider world beyond Umbraloon before the full weight of ancient obligations could settle around her shoulders like chains. But even as part of her yearned for that freedom, she found her attention drawn back to Darius, who was speaking in low tones with Elder Matthias near the ceremonial brazier. The firelight played across his features, highlighting the sharp line of his jaw and the way his silver eyes seemed to hold depths she couldn't fathom. When he looked up and caught her watching him, something passed between them. A recognition, perhaps, of the complexity of what lay ahead, of the fact that neither of their lives would ever be quite the same after tonight. "The pendant," Marcus said quietly, appearing at her elbow with the sudden intensity that always accompanied his scholarly discoveries. "May I examine it? There are texts in the archive, references to artifacts that were thought lost centuries ago. If what I suspect is true, what do you suspect?" Seraphina asked, her hand moving instinctively to cover the metal disc at her throat. "That you, my dear girl, are the key to mysteries that have puzzled scholars for generations. And that tomorrow, when the sun rises over Umbraloon, nothing in our small world will look quite the same as it did this morning." As they filed out of the great hall into the cool night air, Seraphina couldn't shake the feeling that Marcus was right. The failed ritual had set something in motion, had awakened possibilities that had been sleeping in the shadows for far too long. Behind them, the torches continued to burn in their ancient sconces, casting dancing shadows on walls that had witnessed centuries of similar ceremonies. But tonight felt different. Tonight felt like the beginning of something that would change everything, whether she was ready for it or not. The pendant at her throat pulsed once more, so softly she might have imagined it, and she wondered what other secrets it might be hiding, what other truths it might reveal when the time was right. But for now, all she could do was follow Elena through the winding streets toward whatever revelations the morning might bring, acutely aware that behind her, Darius's silver eyes were watching her go with an expression she couldn't read, but somehow felt in her bones. The night air carried the scent of approaching rain, and somewhere in the distance, the village bells chimed midnight, marking the end of one chapter and the uncertain beginning of another. Dawn crept over Umbraloon like a reluctant witness, casting long shadows through Elena's cottage windows as Serafina sat at the worn wooden table, cradling a cup of chamomile tea that had long since grown cold. She had barely slept, her mind churning with questions that seemed to multiply with each passing hour. The pendant lay before her on the table's scarred surface, its ancient metal dull in the morning light, giving no hint of the power that had surged through it the night before. "Your grandmother never told you about the stellar line?" Elena asked for the third time, her weathered hands busy with crushing herbs for the day's preparations. The familiar sounds of mortar against pestle provided a comforting rhythm that did little to ease Serafina's growing anxiety. "She spoke in riddles," Serafina replied, running her finger along the pendant's engraved surface. "Stories about ancestors who served in golden courts, about bloodlines that carried both gifts and curses. But I always thought they were just tales meant to make me feel special, to give weight to our family name when we had little else." Elena paused in her work, studying Serafina's face with the keen attention of someone who had spent decades reading the subtle signs of illness and distress in others. "Perhaps it's time you learned that some tales carry more truth than fiction. The stellar line was real, child. And if that pendant reacted as I suspect it did, then you are the last of a lineage that many believed had died out centuries ago." A sharp knock at the cottage door interrupted their conversation, followed immediately by Marcus's voice calling out in scholarly excitement, "Elena, I must speak with Serafina immediately. I've found something in the archives that changes everything." When Elena opened the door, Marcus practically tumbled inside, his arms full of ancient texts bound in cracked leather, his usually neat appearance disheveled from what had clearly been an all-night research session. His eyes were bright with the fever that always gripped him when he stumbled upon a significant discovery, and parchment fragments clung to his robes like autumn leaves. "The Codex Stellaris," he announced breathlessly, carefully placing the largest tome on Elena's table beside the pendant. "I found fragments of it hidden between the pages of a treatise on herb cultivation. Look!" He opened the book with reverent care, revealing pages covered in faded ink and delicate illustrations that seemed to shimmer even in the ordinary morning light. Serafina leaned forward, drawn despite herself by the intricate drawings that decorated the margins. They showed figures in flowing robes, their hands outstretched towards stylized stars, their faces bearing expressions of both power and profound sorrow. But it was the centerpiece illustration that made her breath catch in her throat. A woman wearing a pendant identical to her own, standing before what appeared to be a great assembly of both mortal and immortal beings. "The last stellar queen," Marcus whispered, his finger tracing the air above the illustration without quite touching the precious parchment. "Lady Astoria, who ruled during the time of binding, when the first covenants between our peoples were forged. According to this text, she possessed the ability to bridge the gap between mortal and immortal magic, to create bonds of true consent rather than simple domination." "What happened to her?" Serafina asked, though something in the gravity of Marcus's expression suggested she might not want to know the answer. "She disappeared," Elena said quietly from her position by the window, where she had been watching the street for signs of unwelcome attention. "Along with her entire lineage, according to the official histories. There was a great schism in the council, a disagreement about the nature of the covenants and how much autonomy mortals should retain. Lady Astoria stood for choice, for the right of individuals to determine their own fates even within the bonds of tradition. Marcus nodded grimly. The opposing faction, led by those who believed in absolute hierarchy, staged what amounted to a coup. Lady Astoria and her supporters were exiled, their names struck from the official records, their bloodline supposedly ended. But clearly, he gestured toward the pendant, someone survived. Someone preserved the line in secret, waiting for the right moment to resurface. "And you think that moment is now?" Serafina asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The weight of implication was settling on her shoulders like a heavy cloak, making it difficult to breathe normally. "I think," Marcus said carefully, "that your pendant's reaction to the binding ritual wasn't an accident. I think it was a recognition, a calling. The old magics are stirring, Serafina, and they're looking for someone who can restore the balance that was lost all those centuries ago." Before anyone could respond, the sound of approaching hoofbeats echoed through the quiet morning air. Eleanor moved quickly to the window, her expression tightening as she peered through the curtains. "Council guards," she reported tersely. "6 of them, and they're heading directly for my door." Serafina's heart began to race as she reached for the pendant, but Marcus caught her wrist gently. "Leave it on the table," he advised. "If they're here on official business, it's better they don't see you touching it. Let them think it's merely a family heirloom with no particular significance." The knock that came was formal and precise, the kind that brooked no delay. Elena opened the door to reveal Captain Aldrich, the head of Darius's personal guard, his weather-beaten face set in lines of professional courtesy that didn't quite mask his underlying tension. "Lady Elena," he said with a respectful nod, "I'm here on orders from the leader to escort Miss Serafina to the council chambers. She's expected for a formal interview regarding last night's irregularities." "An interview or an interrogation?" Elena asked pointedly, moving slightly to block the captain's view into the cottage's interior. "That depends entirely on Miss Serafina's willingness to cooperate," Aldrich replied, though his tone suggested he personally hoped for the former. "The leader has assured the council that she will be treated with all due courtesy and respect. However, the nature of what occurred during the ritual has raised questions that must be answered." Serafina stood slowly, forcing her hands to remain steady as she faced the captain. "What kind of questions?" "Questions about your heritage, your family's history, and the artifact you wear. There are those among the council who believe that certain bloodlines carry obligations as well as privileges, and that those obligations cannot be ignored simply because they are inconvenient." The threat in his words was subtle but unmistakable. Serafina glanced back at Marcus, who was carefully closing the ancient text while trying to appear casual about it. Eleanor moved to her side, placing a protective hand on her shoulder. "She'll come willingly," Eleanor said before Serafina could speak, "but I'll be accompanying her as her advocate. The old laws provide for that right, and I invoke it now." Captain Aldrich nodded, though his relief was visible. "That would be appreciated." The leader specifically mentioned that Miss Serafina should have council present during the proceedings. As they prepared to leave, Marcus caught Serafina's eye and mouthed a single word: "Remember." She nodded slightly, understanding. Remember who she was. Remember that she had choices. Remember that the blood in her veins carried both power and responsibility in equal measure. The journey to the council chambers felt simultaneously too long and too short. Serafina found herself cataloguing details of the village she had known all her life, as if seeing them for the first time. The way the morning light caught the carved symbols above doorways, the subtle deference that ordinary citizens showed to the mounted guards, the careful distance that merchants maintained from anything that might be construed as immortal business. The Great Hall looked different in daylight, less dramatic, but somehow more imposing. Natural light streamed through high windows, illuminating tapestries that depicted the history of human immortal cooperation in careful, idealized scenes. The ceremonial braziers had been extinguished, replaced by simple but elegant arrangements of fresh flowers that spoke of careful attention to aesthetic detail. Darius stood near the great fireplace at the hall's far end, his formal robes exchanged for simpler clothing that somehow made him seem more approachable and more dangerous at the same time. The silver threads in his dark hair caught the light as he turned to watch their approach, and Serafina felt that same flutter of confused attraction that had complicated her feelings the night before. "Serafina," he said simply, inclining his head in a gesture that managed to be both respectful and commanding. "Thank you for coming." "Did I have a choice?" she asked, proud that her voice remained steady despite the rapid beating of her heart. "There are always choices," he replied, and something in his tone suggested layers of meaning she wasn't quite ready to unpack. "The question is whether we're brave enough to make them when the consequences are uncertain." Elder Matthias materialized from the shadows near the window, moving with the deliberate care of someone whose age was measured in centuries rather than decades. Behind him came two other council members Serafina didn't recognize, a stern-faced woman with silver hair and a younger man whose beauty carried the otherworldly perfection that marked him as one of the older immortal bloodlines. "Miss Serafina," Elder Matthias began without preamble, "we find ourselves in the unusual position of dealing with a situation that has no clear precedent in our records. The failure of a formal binding ritual, combined with the apparent awakening of an artifact of unknown provenance, raises questions that demand answers." "What questions?" Serafina asked, though she suspected she already knew. "Questions about your true heritage," the silver-haired woman interjected, her voice carrying the crisp authority of someone accustomed to having her words treated as law. "About the legitimacy of any claims your bloodline might make upon council traditions. About whether you represent a threat to the stability we have worked centuries to maintain." Darius stepped forward before Serafina could respond, his movement placing him slightly between her and the other council members. "Lady Vivienne raises valid concerns," he said diplomatically, "but I would suggest that we approach this matter with the care it deserves. Serafina has done nothing wrong, and until we understand more about what occurred last night, accusations serve no one." "Accusations?" Serafina felt her temper flare despite Elena's warning touch on her arm. "I'm being accused of something now. For wearing a pendant my grandmother left me. For having the audacity to exist in a way that doesn't fit neatly into your ancient categories. You're being asked to explain," the beautiful young man said smoothly, "why an artifact that by all rights should be inert in mortal hands responded to an immortal binding ritual, as if you possessed magical heritage that our records claim was extinguished generations ago." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from an extinguished candle, heavy and impossible to ignore. Serafina felt the weight of their combined attention pressing down on her, demanding answers she simply didn't have. But beneath the fear and confusion, something else was stirring. A stubborn determination that had gotten her into trouble before and would likely do so again. "I can't explain what I don't understand," she said finally, "but I can tell you this, whatever power runs in my veins, whatever heritage I carry, it doesn't make me anyone's property. The binding failed because I didn't consent to it, not because of some magical bloodline or ancient artifact. And if that threatens your stability, perhaps the problem isn't with me." The silence that followed her declaration was profound and charged with tension. Elder Matthias exchanged glances with his colleagues, while Darius watched Serafina with an expression that might have been admiration or concern or something more complicated entirely. "Brave words," Lady Vivienne said finally, But heritage carries obligations as well as privileges. If you are indeed of the stellar line, as certain evidence suggests, then you cannot simply ignore the responsibilities that come with that blood. What responsibilities? Elena asked sharply, speaking for the first time since their arrival. The stellar line was exiled, their claims forfeited. Even if Serafina carries that heritage, she owes nothing to a council that cast her ancestors out. That, Elder Matthias said quietly, is a matter of some debate. The exile was never formally ratified by the full council, and there are those who argue that the bloodline's obligations remained intact regardless of political circumstances. Darius moved closer to Serafina, close enough that she could feel the coolness that seemed to emanate from his skin, close enough to catch the subtle scent of winter winds and ancient forests that clung to him like an invisible cloak. When he spoke, his words were intended for her ears, alone. "The pendant," he murmured so softly she had to strain to hear him. "Has it shown you anything else? Dreams, visions, memories that don't feel like your own?" She started to shake her head, then paused as fragments of recent dreams flickered through her mind. Images of a great library filled with books bound in starlight, of figures in flowing robes standing in circles of power, of a voice speaking words in a language she didn't recognize, but somehow understood. She had dismissed them as anxiety-induced fantasies, but now, sometimes, she admitted reluctantly, but they don't make sense. They feel like stories someone else is telling, not like anything real. "The pendant isn't just jewelry," Darius said, his silver eyes intense with something that might have been hope or fear. "It's a key, a repository of memories and knowledge passed down through your bloodline. If it's truly awakening, then you may have access to information that could change everything we thought we knew about the early covenants." "And if I don't want that information?" Serafina asked. "If I don't want to be the key to anything? What if I just want to live my life without carrying the weight of centuries-old obligations?" Darius was quiet for a long moment, his gaze searching her face as if looking for answers to questions she couldn't hear. When he spoke again, his voice carried a note of something that sounded almost like regret. "Then I'm afraid, Serafina, that you may not have that choice, because whether you want it or not, the old powers have awakened, and they've chosen you as their vessel. The only question now is whether you'll learn to master them before they master you." As if summoned by his words, the pendant at her throat began to warm against her skin, its surface growing hot enough to make her gasp. For a moment, the great hall seemed to fade around her, replaced by visions of a time when magic flowed freely between mortal and immortal realms, when the boundaries between their worlds were permeable and constantly shifting. She saw herself standing in a circle of power, her hands outstretched toward figures she recognized as her ancestors, their voices joining in a harmony that resonated through her bones, like the memory of songs she had never learned. When the vision faded, she found herself on her knees on the cold stone floor, Elena's hands supporting her while Darius knelt beside them both, his face pale with concern. The assembled council members had drawn closer, their expressions ranging from worry to fascination to something that looked uncomfortably like hunger. "It's beginning," Elder Matthias whispered, his ancient voice filled with awe. "After all these centuries, the stellar line awakens once more. The question now is whether any of us are prepared for what comes next." But as Serafina struggled to her feet, still shaky from whatever had just occurred, she couldn't shake the feeling that preparation might be a luxury none of them could afford. The pendant's warmth was spreading through her chest, like spilled wine, carrying with it memories and knowledge that felt both foreign and intimately familiar. And somewhere in the distance, she could swear she heard the sound of bells tolling, marking time until a moment of reckoning that was approaching faster than any of them realized. The weeks that followed blurred together like watercolors in rain, each day bringing new revelations that reshaped everything Serafina thought she knew about herself and the world around her. The council had granted her a temporary reprieve, time to explore her awakening abilities under careful supervision while they debated the implications of her heritage. But freedom, she was learning, was a relative concept when every breath you took was monitored by beings who could hear your heartbeat from across a room. Elena's cottage had become a sanctuary of sorts, its humble walls now housing an impossible collection of ancient texts that Marcus smuggled from the archives with increasing boldness. The scholar had thrown himself into research with the fervor of a man possessed, mapping bloodlines and tracing genealogies through centuries of carefully obscured records. His discoveries painted a picture that grew more complex with each passing day. "The exile wasn't what we thought," he announced one evening as autumn's first chill crept through the windows. His eyes were red-rimmed from squinting at faded manuscripts by candlelight, but his excitement was undimmed. Lady Astoria wasn't cast out for rebellion. She was murdered, along with most of her court. The official records were altered afterward to hide the truth. Serafina looked up from the pendant in her hands, its surface now warm with constant activation. Over the past weeks, it had shown her fragments of memory that painted vivid pictures of a world very different from the one she knew. Murdered by whom? A faction within the council that feared the Stellar Line's growing influence, Marcus replied, spreading yellowed pages across Elena's kitchen table. They believed that true magical partnership between mortal and immortal would upset the natural order, threaten their authority. So they struck during the harvest festival when the court was gathered for the traditional bonding ceremonies. Eleanor paused in her preparation of evening tea, her weathered hands stilling on the ceramic pot. "That's why the festival has always felt different to me," she murmured, heavy with grief that no one remembers the reason for. The pendant pulsed against Serafina's palm, and suddenly she was elsewhere, standing in a great hall decorated with ribbons of gold and crimson. She could hear laughter, see couples joining hands under starlight, streaming through crystal windows. But beneath the celebration lurked something dark, figures in shadow moving with deadly purpose, the whisper of steel being drawn, the sharp copper scent of blood spilling across sacred stones. When the vision faded, she found tears on her cheeks, and Darius standing in Elena's doorway, his silver eyes dark with concern. He had taken to appearing at unexpected moments, always with some official reason, but clearly driven by something more personal than duty. "The memories are getting stronger," he observed, moving into the cottage with the fluid grace that marked all his movements. "The pendant is responding to the approach of the new moon. When the binding must be reconsidered," Serafina said, not quite managing to keep the bitterness from her voice. The council's deadline hung over everything like storm clouds, a constant reminder that her time was running out. Yes, Darius accepted the cup of tea Eleanor offered him, though she doubted he actually needed the warmth. But perhaps not in the way any of us expected. Something in his tone made her look up sharply. "What do you mean?" Instead of answering immediately, he withdrew a scroll sealed with black wax from his formal robes. "Cordelia has formally petitioned the council for the right to contest your claim to the binding. She argues that if you are indeed of the Stellar Line, then ancient law gives her, as a representative of the nobility that survived the Purge, the right to challenge your worthiness." The words hit like physical blows. "Challenge how?" "Trial by ordeal," Marcus said grimly, recognizing the terminology from his research. "Single combat, riddles of power, or—" He trailed off, unwilling to voice the third option. "Or ritual sacrifice," Darius finished quietly. "The defeated party forfeits not just their claim, but their life force to the victor." Serafina felt the cottage walls closing in around her, the weight of centuries pressing down until she could barely breathe. "And if I refuse, then you're deemed unworthy by default, and the binding proceeds immediately." Darius's voice was carefully neutral, but she could see the tension in the set of his shoulders. the way his hands gripped the teacup with barely controlled force. Cordelia would become my consort, and you would be exiled beyond the realm's borders. Some choice, she said bitterly, standing to pace the small room's confines. Fight for my life or lose everything I've ever known. There is another option, Elena said quietly from her position by the window. One that the old texts mention, but that hasn't been invoked in over 3 centuries. All eyes turned to her, and she continued with the careful deliberation of someone who understood the weight of her words. The right of true binding. If both parties consent freely and completely, if they offer not just their hands, but their hearts to the union, then no external challenge can break what they create. But it requires absolute honesty, absolute trust, and absolute willingness to share not just their futures, but their very souls. Serafina's gaze flew to Darius, searching his face for some hint of his thoughts. The idea of binding herself to him completely, of opening every corner of her mind and heart to his scrutiny, was both terrifying and strangely appealing. But the cost of such intimacy, the loss of the independence she had fought so hard to preserve, felt like another kind of death. The choice would still be yours, Darius said softly, as if reading her thoughts. But it would be a choice made in truth, rather than under threat. And whatever we built together would be ours alone, free from the Council's interference or ancient obligations. Before she could respond, the sound of approaching horses echoed through the evening air. Elena moved quickly to peer through the curtains, her expression tightening with alarm. "Cordelia," she reported, "with a full escort. She's coming here." The cottage door burst open without ceremony, revealing Cordelia in all her terrible beauty. Her golden hair was arranged in elaborate braids, woven with silver chains that caught the lamplight like captured stars, and her dress of deep blue silk was cut to emphasize both her beauty and her authority. Behind her came Captain Aldrich and 4 other guards, their hands resting meaningfully on their sword hilts. "How cozy," Cordelia said, her voice dripping with false sweetness as she surveyed the humble interior. The pretender to ancient nobility, hiding among the common folk, playing at being something she's not. "I never claimed to be anything but myself," Serafina replied, forcing her voice to remain steady despite the rage building in her chest. "Yourself?" Cordelia laughed, the sound sharp as breaking crystal, a village girl with delusions of grandeur, clutching a trinket and believing it makes her special. "You have no idea what real power looks like, child. No understanding of the sacrifices required to wield it." "Then enlighten me," Serafina said, stepping forward despite Elena's restraining hand on her arm. "Tell me what power means to you." Cordelia's smile turned predatory. "Power means knowing that when you want something, you take it. It means understanding that the strong rule and the weak serve, and that pretty ideals about choice and consent are luxuries that only the naive can afford." Her gaze flicked to Darius, lingering on his face with possessive hunger. "It means recognizing that some bonds are too important to leave to the whims of untrained children." The pendant at Serafina's throat flared with sudden heat, responding to her surge of anger with an intensity that made the cottage's shadows dance. For a moment, she felt the weight of her ancestors' memories, their rage at betrayal and murder, their determination to protect what they had built from those who would corrupt it. "The strong rule and the weak serve," she repeated, her voice carrying harmonics that hadn't been there moments before. "Is that what you told yourself when your faction murdered Lady Astoria and her court? When you slaughtered innocents to preserve your precious hierarchy?" Cordelia's composure cracked, revealing something ugly beneath her perfect features. "How dare you?" "I dare because I remember," Serafina interrupted, the pendant's power flowing through her like molten silver. "I remember the screams in the Great Hall, the blood on the ceremonial stones, the way you celebrated afterward while families mourned their dead. I remember because their memories live in me, and they demand justice." The cottage erupted into chaos. Cordelia lunged forward with inhuman speed, her fingernails extending into claws that could have torn Serafina's throat open. But Darius was faster, his own supernatural reflexes carrying him between them in a blur of motion that sent the blonde woman stumbling backward into her guards. "Enough!" he roared, his voice carrying an authority that made even Cordelia hesitate. "This ends now, before blood is spilled on sacred ground." "Sacred ground?" Cordelia spat, regaining her balance with feline grace. "This hovel, you've forgotten yourself, Darius, forgotten what you owe to those who elevated you to leadership." "I owe allegiance to justice," he replied, his silver eyes burning with cold fire. "And justice demands that the crimes of the past be acknowledged before we can build a better future." Marcus stepped forward, his scholar's courage finally overcoming his natural caution. "The records are clear, Lady Cordelia. Your family was among those who orchestrated the massacre of the Stellar Court. The bloodstains on your lineage run deeper than any claim to nobility you might make." "Lies!" Cordelia shrieked, her composure completely shattered now. "Fabrications created by those too weak to accept the natural order." "Then prove it," Serafina said quietly, the pendant's power giving her words a weight that silenced the room. "Submit to the trial you demanded, but let it be a trial of truth, not strength. Let the old magics judge between us and see which of us serves the greater good." Cordelia's eyes narrowed to slits of calculation. "You think your little trinket makes you my equal? Very well. I accept your challenge, pretender, but when I tear the truth from your lying throat, remember that you brought this upon yourself." She spun on her heel and stalked from the cottage, her guards following in her wake. But her parting words carried clearly through the night air. 3 days until the new moon. Prepare yourself, child. You're going to learn the difference between playing at power and possessing it. When the sound of hoofbeats had faded into the distance, Serafina sank into a chair, the pendant's energy leaving her feeling drained and strangely hollow. The cottage felt too small now, its walls unable to contain the magnitude of what she had committed herself to. "I don't know how to fight her," she admitted, the words barely above a whisper. "I don't even fully understand what I am, let alone how to use whatever power I might possess." Darius knelt beside her chair, his cool hands covering hers with surprising gentleness. "Then we have 3 days to learn," he said simply. 3 days to unlock the secrets your bloodline has kept hidden, to prepare you for a battle that will determine not just our future, but the future of everyone in this realm. Eleanor moved to the window, peering out at the star-filled sky with an expression of deep thought. "The old groves," she said suddenly, "beyond the village boundaries, where the ancient rites were once performed. If we're going to awaken her full heritage, that's where it must happen." "The groves are forbidden," Marcus protested. "No one has set foot there in over a century." "No one has had reason to," Elena corrected, "but desperate times call for desperate measures. And if Serafina is truly the last of the stellar line, then the groves will recognize her blood and respond to her need." Over the next 3 days, they worked with fevered intensity to prepare. Elena taught Serafina the old rituals, the proper ways to channel power without being consumed by it. Marcus provided historical context, helping her understand the political and magical forces she would be facing. And Darius taught her to fight, not with swords or conventional weapons, but with the deeper magics that flowed between their kinds. He showed her how to sense the currents of power that surrounded them, how to draw strength from the earth and sky, how to weave protection and striking force from the same fundamental energies that bound their realm together. But it was in the quiet moments between lessons that she began to understand the true nature of what was growing between them. When he caught her as she stumbled during a particularly difficult exercise, when his silver eyes softened with concern as he watched her push herself to exhaustion, when he spoke of futures that included both of them working together to heal old wounds and build new bridges. "Why?" she asked him on the final night, as they sat together in Eleanor's garden under stars that seemed unusually bright. Why are you helping me instead of simply accepting Cordelia's suit? It would be easier for everyone. He was quiet for so long that she began to think he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his words were carefully measured, as if he were revealing secrets he had kept even from himself. "Because I've spent centuries believing that duty was enough," he said softly. "That leadership meant accepting what was expected rather than fighting for what was right. But watching you, seeing the way you refuse to compromise your principles, even when it would be safer to bend, you've shown me that some things are worth fighting for, even when the odds seem impossible. And if I don't survive tomorrow," his hands covered hers, cool skin warming under her touch, "then I'll spend the rest of my existence ensuring that your sacrifice wasn't in vain. That the ideals you represent, choice, consent, the right to determine one's own destiny, become the foundation of a new order." The next evening, as the new moon rose invisible over Umbraloon, they gathered in the ancient grove. The trees here were older than memory, their trunks twisted into shapes that suggested they had witnessed powers beyond mortal comprehension. In the center of the grove stood a circle of standing stones, their surfaces carved with symbols that seemed to shift and dance in the flickering torchlight. Cordelia arrived with fanfare, her escort including several council members who clearly supported her claim. She had dressed for battle in flowing robes of midnight blue, her golden hair loose around her shoulders like a war banner. The smile on her perfect features was sharp enough to cut glass. "Ready to face reality, pretender," she called across the clearing. "Ready to learn what happens to those who reach beyond their station." Seraphina stepped into the circle of stones, the pendant at her throat glowing with steady silver light. Around her, she could feel the presence of her ancestors, their memories and strength flowing through her like an underground river finally reaching the surface. "I'm ready," she replied, and her voice carried the certainty of someone who had finally found her true purpose. "The question is whether you're prepared for the truth of what you've become." The trial began with ritual words spoken in the old tongue, oaths that bound both participants to accept whatever judgment the ancient magics would render. But as power began to flow between them, as the very air grew thick with competing energies, Seraphina realized that this wasn't really about her worthiness or Cordelia's claims. This was about the soul of their entire realm, whether it would continue to be ruled by fear and hierarchy, or whether it could evolve into something better, something worthy of the sacrifices her ancestors had made and the future she was fighting to protect. The pendant flared brighter, and Seraphina felt the full weight of her heritage settling around her shoulders like a cloak made of starlight. Whatever happened next, she would face it as herself, not as a pawn in someone else's game, but as the last daughter of a line that had always stood for justice, even unto death. The battle for the future of Umbraloon was about to begin, and she intended to win.